America's favorite Bible verse when I became a Christian in the 1970s, without a doubt, was John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. But sometime between that period and now, America changed its new favorite Bible verse. Now it's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Judge not that you be not judged. So we've got some work to do, I think, today to clear away some of the brush, the undergrowth that has grown up around this teaching of Jesus. And we need God's help to do that today. I want to read the passage in its entirety. And so I'm actually going to ask you, if you would, to stand up once more, just in reverence for God's word, and hear the word of the Lord. You can follow along up here or look at your own Bible. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how could you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks it will be open. For which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Judge not that you may not be judged is another example of Jesus' proverbial wisdom, like other proverbial statements we've been seeing in the Sermon on the Mount. Like his other ethical instruction there, this command can easily be misunderstood. Judge not, at first glance, sounds like all judging is forbidden. But when we read it in context, we find that there is a certain way of judging others, not all judgments, that is being forbidden. Let me just argue briefly for the necessity of making moral judgments. We live in a moral world where good and evil exist, and making our way through this world without moral discernment and judgments is a recipe for disaster. The Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, believe it or not, concluded from this passage that we should get rid of all law courts. What? That's a very literal reading of this passage. Jesus began the middle section of his sermon telling his disciples and his hearers that their righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees and scribes, and if they would enter the kingdom. That is making a judgment about the quality of Pharisaical righteousness. In chapter 6, he was telling us not to be like the hypocrites in how we give or how we pray or how we fast. how can we not be like them if we don't judge who those hypocrites are? In a few verses, he's going to warn us about the dangers of false prophets dressed in sheep's clothing, but who inwardly are actually ravenous wolves. And he says that we'll know them by their fruits. That is making a judgment about leaders based on what we see in their lives. In verse 6, right in the passage we've just read, Jesus is going to counsel us to not give what is holy to dogs and to not cast our pearls before swine. So let's acknowledge right up front, that's a really enigmatic statement. What does Jesus mean? But at the very least, he's counseling us to do some careful judging. When Jesus says, "Judge not that you may not be judged," he is not prohibiting all judgments, even about other people. But Jesus' teaching is highlighting that there are some great dangers associated with judging others. Before we get to the dangers, let's talk a little bit about what it means to judge not. It's helpful to keep in mind that the word to judge does have a wide variety of meanings, from simply making a choice or expressing a preference, all the way to the idea of a determination to condemn something or even someone. My paraphrase of chapter 7, verse 1, based on the context, is this. Here's what I think. Here's how I would paraphrase what Jesus is saying. Don't make judgments of others as if you were in the place of God. We can call this judgmentalism. Don't be judgmental. And it implies a couple of things. First, no one should put themselves in the place of condemning other people. We don't have the wisdom, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the foresight of the future to condemn anyone. Judge not means refrain from condemning others. John Stott said, "The command to judge not is not a requirement to be blind, but rather a plea to be generous." I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The second observation I want to make about what it means to judge not is that judge not means that we should not judge others unfairly. We should not judge others unfairly. Got a double negative in there. As unfair judgment is one that is either based upon a partial understanding or maybe even a false standard, we should be careful in our judgments. Well, someone may say, well, all our understanding is partial. And all of our understanding is imperfect, and that's certainly true. That's a reason for holding our judgments with humility. But while our understanding is never exhaustive, our understanding of situations and even of people can be substantial, and we can judge righteously. Jesus commanded us actually to do this in John chapter 7. One of the recurring points of contention between Jesus and the Jewish leaders was the matter of healing people on the Sabbath. The miracles on the Sabbath were like waving a red flag in front of a bull. The Jewish leadership, actually in response, went right for the jugular. They literally wanted to kill Jesus because of this. Here's Jesus' response. On the Sabbath day, a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken. Are you angry with me, he says, because on the Sabbath I made a whole body well? Yes, the law said to not work on the Sabbath. That's the appearance of things. But that's not the whole picture. If the law allows for the religious rite of circumcision to be performed on the Sabbath, what could be more appropriate than healing a human being of a debilitating or disease or disability on the Sabbath? Jesus concluded his argument with this exhortation: do not judge by appearances, but judge with righteous judgment. I think that is Jesus' paraphrase of judge not. Scott McKnight wisely observes that the crux of the issue is that we must learn the difference between moral discernment and personal condemnation. This distinction between the ability to discern the difference between good and bad versus the posture of condemning another person. And that difference, that distinction, enables us, I think, to read this passage properly. Scott McKnight goes on to quote John Wesley's excellent commentary on Judge Not Lest You Be Judged. John Wesley said, "The judging that Jesus condemns here is thinking about another person in a way that is contrary to love." I think that's good. Let's flesh out the difference between moral discernment and condemnation. Let me just make a few statements about the difference between those two things. Condemnation focuses on the person. Moral discernment focuses on the fault. Condemnation speaks in absolute language. Never, always. Discernment is more temporary and makes allowance for others to make progress. Condemnation has no place in it for forgiveness. Discernment makes room for grace and mercy to be extended. Condemnation consigns persons to hopelessness. Discernment speaks hope for the future. So here's what I take as the big idea of this whole passage that we've read previously. Be careful how you judge. Jesus gives two reasons in verses 1 through 5 why we must take care in judging others. The first reason is that how we judge others actually establishes the standard of judgment by which God will judge us. I get that from verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, Jesus says, "Judge not that you may not be judged." Then he says, and note the word that introduces verse 2, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." That little word "for" is introducing the explanation that follows in verse 2. In other words, that you may not be judged is being explained by verse 2. Verse 1 is not saying that we can avoid God's judgment. We can't. Scripture everywhere affirms that we will give an account of ourselves to God. We will be judged. But Jesus is saying that if we apply a strict or harsh standard of judgment to others, that same standard will be applied to us when we are judged by God. So let me ask you a question. Who do you want to make judgments about you? Someone who is rigid and strict and legalistic, or someone who's also acting in mercy? Do you want the strict standard, or do you want mercy to be mixed with it? one of the saddest cases of a strict judge is Inspector Javert in the novel written by Victor Hugo called Les Miserables. I know that probably many of you have seen the play or one of the films, many films. Inspector Javert was first a prison guard and then later a police inspector. And his character is defined by his legalistic tendencies and his complete lack of empathy for anyone who's ever broken the law in any measure or form. In Les Miserables, he becomes obsessed with the pursuit and punishment of Jean Valjean after he has, in fact, violated his parole. In the course of his career, Inspector Javert is actually saved from an execution by Jean Valjean. But the internal conflict that this sets up in his conscience is simply unbearable. He must either die or arrest Jean Valjean and see him executed. In hopelessness, he commits suicide by casting himself in the river Seine. He had no place for mercy in his life. None of us want to be judged by that kind of person. Jesus is saying, don't be a legalist, and you won't be judged as a legalist. The second reason we should be careful is that we should be careful how we judge because of our amazing capacity for hypocrisy. And I get that from verses 3 to 5. And I want to begin with a visual picture of what Jesus is actually talking about. When you look at that picture, I hope you feel a little bit like laughing. What kind of picture is that? This looks like a scene out of Laurel and Hardy. I think we're so accustomed and used to this idea of a plank in the eye and a speck in the eye that we probably lost the sense of humor that we should have when we read this and think about what Jesus is talking about. The problem with logs and specks is not that we can't discern right and wrong in one another, but that we need to do this discernment with an awareness of our own faults and our inability to judge rightly. Karen and I have sometimes called this the Siegfried syndrome. Ever since our first time through that wonderful series of books and later the film series entitled All Creatures Great and Small. How many of you have seen All Creatures? See, at least half of you have seen that. You know the story. For those of you who don't know the story, it's about the main character is Jim Harriet, who is a young vet just out of school that joins a veterinary practice in the Yorkshire Dales of England that's owned by Siegfried Farnan. It's actually based upon true characters, although that's not their true names. One of the endearing attributes of Siegfried is his amazing capacity to play the bumbling hypocrite who regularly lectures James on the fine points of being the perfect manager of a veterinary practice. Of course, Siegfried regularly turns customer situations into a total mess by being and doing exactly what he's lecturing James that he should not be and should not do. That's the humorous side. There's a humorous side to this. But you know what? There's also an ugly side. Let me give you an example of the ugly side. It's the story of King David and Nathan. You remember that sometime after David's sin with Bathsheba and then the arranged death of her husband Uriah, that the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David. Nathan came to King David and he told him a story about a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man had all kinds of flocks, hundreds, probably thousands of flocks. And the poor man had one little lamb that was like a pet in his family. And one day a traveler came to the rich man, Nathan is telling this story, and he took the poor man's lamb, and he actually sacrificed it, prepared it for supper. Then David's anger burned against that man, the story tells. This man deserves to die, David says. And Nathan says, you are the man. King David had lost sight of himself. Jesus' teaching in verses 3 through 5 is where the inspiration for the title of my message come from. We will never judge others rightly if we don't keep one eye on ourselves in the mirror. This is the first time that the charge of hypocrisy has been leveled at Jesus. I mean, he speaks this like he's speaking to the audience and says, you hypocrites. And he actually uses the singular, you hypocrites. It's actually a bit shocking. But it is the fourth time that the word hypocrite has occurred in this part of the sermon. Jesus has warned his hearers not to give like the hypocrites, not to pray like the hypocrites, not to fast like the hypocrites. And now he exposes the judgmental person as a hypocrite, someone who is pretending to be what they're not. They are play acting at perfection. They are play acting at perfection before others, when in fact they are seriously flawed. What's the impact of being aware of our own faults? What is it that Jesus wants us to get from keeping one eye on the mirror as we speak about others? Judging others with one eye on the mirror helps to create an impulse of mercy. Later in Matthew, we read a parable about a servant who owed a debt to his king. That debt was so large, 10,000 talents, and a working man earned about a talent per year. So 10,000 years of debt to be paid off. And the king orders that his servant and his whole family, in fact, be sold into slavery, and so he can make some return for all this money that's been loaned. And the servant casts himself before the king on his knees and begs for mercy and patience to pay him back. And in mercy, the king forgives his debt. And the man is free to start his life all over again, debt-free. But when that servant had left his king's presence and saw a man that owed him a pittance in comparison, he grabbed this man around the neck and began to choke him. The man begged for patience, but instead of patience, the unforgiving servant cast him into prison. The unforgiving servant forgot to keep one eye on the mirror. The immediate result was a harsh judgment of this fellow servant. And the ultimate result was that the king revoked his mercy and judged the unforgiving servant in the same way that he had judged this man and cast him into prison. You know, we're going to transition into into verse 6. So that this is completing our understanding, our teaching on verses 1 through 5. But even as we make this transition, it's surprising to me how many commentators suggest that what follows in verse 6 has no connection to verses 1 through 5. The way that this sermon has been unfolding, verse by verse, shows great structure and order and carefulness. You know, there are some commentators who treat this passage like it's just kind of a grocery list, and Matthew got tired and he just couldn't figure out where to put this stuff, so let's throw it in right here. I think that's really a bad reading of this passage. Matthew 7:6 says, "Don't give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." I think that verse 6 is actually a needed caution to not neglect careful judging of others. There's actually 5 metaphors in this passage in this one verse that have to be explained. We're going to just explain them briefly. The first 2 metaphors are holy things and pearls. What are those? What is Jesus talking about? I think that the best answer is that he's talking about the truths of the kingdom that he's been teaching them in this sermon. The second 2 metaphors are dogs and pigs. Who are the dogs and the pigs? In a Jewish audience, this would have been immediately known and understood because the Gentiles were regularly called dogs and swine by the Jews because of their uncleanness and their ignorance of God and His ways. But the answer here as to who are the pigs and the dogs seems to be that Jesus is implying that it's not the Jews. He in fact is speaking to a Jewish audience. But rather, I think the best answer is that he's talking about those who have hardened their heart to the gospel of the kingdom. The final metaphor says that we should not give the holy things to dogs, and we should not cast pearls before swine. And I think that simply means that we are to be judging carefully as we deal with people, as we share the gospel with people, and be careful of those who have hardened their hearts against the truth of the gospel, who are in fact rejecting, and who in fact may be persecuting those who are sharing the good news. It can't possibly mean simply unbelievers. We couldn't fulfill the Great Commission that Jesus is going to give us in the Gospel of Matthew if we just simply stop talking to unbelievers. What makes the most sense is to put this teaching in the context of the complete rejection of the gospel and the persecution of those who are bringing the message of the kingdom to others. And the context really is a smaller context. It's not thinking about a people group. It's talking about people that you're actually encountering and sharing the gospel with. You know, I think that Jesus is the best example of what he's trying to teach us here. Think back to his response to Pilate and Herod during his trial. When Jesus appeared before Pilate, it's interesting actually to read the conversation that takes place between Jesus and Pilate. Pilate has questions, and Jesus gives him answers. he really speaks clearly to the fact that he is a king. And Pilate's in turmoil because the mob outside is demanding his death. And he wants to free Jesus. He wants to release him. But he's afraid of that mob. During the course of his trial before Pilate, Pilate realizes that Jesus is a Galilean. He's from Galilee. And so he decides to send him to Herod, who is the ruler over Galilee. So Herod apparently is in town in Jerusalem at this time. He sends him over to Herod, and perhaps he's even just trying to pass off making a judgment about Jesus. When Herod saw Jesus, Luke tells us, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at length. We don't know how long that questioning period was, but it wasn't just 3 or 4 questions. And Luke tells us that Jesus made no answer to Herod. The chief priests and the scribes were standing there vehemently accusing and denouncing Jesus. And later, Herod, with his soldiers, are going to treat him with contempt and mock him, arraying him in splendid clothing, and then sending him back to Pilate. But Jesus speaks not a word to Herod. There are situations and people with whom it is best simply to just be silent. I think that's the advice Jesus is giving. As we move to the next section, I want to invite you to pull out. There's a printout that I've given you today. Let me kind of set up. Let me set this printout up as to why I've given it to you. I can do that by actually just referring you to the first paragraph. There's a significant block of teaching in Matthew 7 through 11 that seems to be focused on application. It's the ask, seek, knock passage. We can call this, I'm going to call this the ask application. The ask application, I think, is very relevant to developing moral discernment about judging others. But as we move toward the conclusion of the passage, it's instructive to recognize that we are concluding actually the whole middle section of this Sermon on the Mount. In other words, verses 7 through 11 is concluding what Jesus has been teaching in verses 1 through 6. But there's something bigger going on here. He's actually concluding everything that he's been teaching since chapter 5, verse 17, up to the present text. The fact that we are coming to the end of this big middle section of Jesus' sermon might impact how we look at these verses. So I'm just going to do a really quick review of what Jesus actually has been teaching us. In verses 17 through 20 of chapter 5, we called that the introduction to this middle section of Jesus' sermon. And let me just read it to you. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, and here's what I think is really the theme verse of everything Jesus is going to say between here and chapter 7, verse 12. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So, what does Jesus then do? Well, after introducing point number 2 in your notes, the greater righteousness of those entering the kingdom is explained and applied to 6 different ethical issues in chapter 5, 18 through 48. The first 3 issues are anger, lust, and divorce, and we can see a loose relationship between those issues. And then point number 3, the second 3 ethical issues are keeping our word. He talks about oaths, generosity and mercy, turning the other cheek, and loving our enemies. Again, we can see a loose relationship between those 3 ethical issues. Continuing with the theme of greater righteousness, point number 4, Jesus then gives instructions on 3 religious practices in 6, 1 through 18. The practice of alms, giving to the poor, the practice of prayer, and the practice of fasting. Number 5, finally, Jesus has concluded this middle section of the Sermon on the Mount with 3 important relationships in chapter 6, verse 19 through chapter 7, verse 6. Our relationship with earthly possessions, our treasures, our relationship to daily needs, our anxieties, and our relationship to people, our judgments. And then comes this final application and conclusion as we draw near to finish this big middle section of chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. So, now, I hope you see the humor of this next comment. I think this analysis of the Sermon on the Mount may be a biblical basis for every preacher preaching a 3-point sermon. What do you think? Do you see all of the 3s? And others have observed that Matthew loves groups of 3 as he records and as he crafts the message and teaching of Jesus. Oftentimes they're in groups of 3. But more seriously, and to the point at hand, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling the challenge of living out the Sermon on the Mount. I think Brad and I we've kept coming back to this again and again as we've preached through these ethical issues and through these religious practices and now through these various relationships. We've come back again and again to the idea that this feels impossible. I've been waiting for Jesus to say that this is impossible and you can't do this apart from the grace of God. And I think that's what Jesus is saying in verses 7 through 11. This is comparable to what Paul says in Philippians 4 when he says, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. I think this is Jesus in verses 7 through 11. I think this is saying that you can do all things through Him who strengthens you. This is a big promise that help is on the way if you are seeking, if you are asking and seeking and knocking. You know, I think the secret to strengthen our pursuit of God, and this is about prayer, but it's even more than prayer. The secret to our pursuit of God is to find some sense within ourselves of how desperately we actually need Him. How desperately we need Him. I'm calling this the final application, the duty to ask. We're going to call it that because there are, once again, 3 things we should do. Ask, seek, and knock. Do you see why I'm calling it ask? Let me make just a couple of observations about this exhortation of asking and seeking and knocking. The repeated commands of this passage emphasize the ongoing character of our pursuit of God and godly virtue. Keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking is an accurate paraphrase of what Jesus is saying. The activity that Jesus is describing in these verses is, in the words of Eugene Peterson, a long obedience in the same direction. I love that description. We don't make progress in our Christian lives largely with big spurts of energy in prayer or seeking God just every so often. Folks, that's not the way we need to be going about developing godly virtue. We need to be incrementally taking the vitamins that we need that are found in God and in His Word and in the fellowship of the saints and in the worship of God and in service to Him. We need to be making incremental steps toward growing into the persons that God is forming us to be in His Son, Jesus Christ. So, this is totally relevant. Whether you're age 70 or whether you're 17 or even 7. Karen was just lamenting this week. I hope she won't mind if I use this lament. She said, I thought it would be easier by now. No. Folks, you don't come to a place where you can coast. You must be persevering. You must keep on asking. You must keep on seeking. You must keep on knocking. The other observation is that this simply is the way that God trains His children in godly virtues. There are no shortcuts to the greater righteousness of the kingdom. If you want the kingdom, you must ask, seek, and knock. And these three things they're really just overlapping spiritual disciplines by which we make progress. Jesus gives one final huge incentive for doing ask. He says the good gifts of greater righteousness are provided by a Father who cares for us and loves us. D.A. Carson comments, what is fundamentally at stake here in this passage is our picture, man's picture of God. God is not a reluctant stranger who has to be bullied into helping us. He is not a malicious tyrant who will trick us. He is a heavenly Father who graciously bestows the good gifts of His kingdom in answer to the pursuit of His children. Brothers and sisters, we need a daily dose of desperation. I would encourage you to pray for desperation. But in the next breath, I would warn you that when God gives that sense of desperation, usually it involves personal pain and suffering. Matthew 7:12, the final verse, is the conclusion to the whole middle section of the sermon. Whatever you wish that others would do for you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. It's a fitting conclusion to Jesus' teaching about judging others. It's a principle that is recommending as you live your life in a relationship with others that you keep one eye on the mirror. As you want others to do to you, do also to them. Jesus says this is the law and the prophets. You notice back part of the reason I read 5:17 is in 17 he began to talk about the law and the prophets. And now he concludes with this phrase, the law and the prophets. This is an ancient way that people orally, when they orally heard the teaching being read, or when they were reading it themselves, seeing these words repeated are like Jesus putting a bookends at the ends of this teaching. This signals we're going to start something new. This is not only a fitting conclusion to the teaching of verses 1 through 11. It's a fitting conclusion to all the ethical teaching of the whole middle section. It's really all about doing unto other people what you want them to do for you. It's similar to saying that the law is summed up in loving your neighbor as yourself. It's really that simple. And it really is also that hard. Simple things are not necessarily easy things unless they're attached to promises of God's grace for our forgiveness in our many faults and His power to help us make progress, be conformed to the image of His Son.